Hey dude, tonight we're drifting back to the crackling firelit halls of 1700s America, a time when George Washington wasn't just leading revolutions, but sitting down to dinners that would probably confuse your modern taste buds. We all know the guy from paintings and dollar bills, but have you ever wondered what he actually ate? Spoiler, it wasn't burgers and fries. From strange colonial stews to long-lost desserts, we're uncovering the forgotten foods served at the Founding Fathers' very own dinner table. Before we jump in, hit that like button and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always cool to see where everyone's joining from. Now dim the lights, and if you've got a partner, give them a hug. If not, don't worry, I'm single too. Let's just chill and dive into tonight's journey. In the quiet Virginia countryside, a sprawling plantation bustled with activity, not just in the tobacco fields but behind the walls of its grand estate, Mount Vernon, the home of George Washington. While most visitors today remember Washington as a general, a founding father, or a silent figure on currency, fewer imagine the sounds and smells of his kitchen. The slow bubbling of squirrel stew, the acrid sting of vinegar used to preserve walnuts, and the soft rustle of aprons worn by enslaved cooks as they stirred, roasted, and kneaded by the hearth. You might be surprised to know that the dining table of George Washington, regal in appearance, was not filled with lavish European-style delicacies, but instead with humble, seasonal, and regional foods. The first president was not known for extravagant tastes. He preferred simple fare, often reflecting the agricultural rhythms of 18th century Virginia. He rarely drank wine, favored hoe cakes made with cornmeal, and enjoyed dried fruits, stewed game meats, and root vegetables in various forms. But if you were to walk into his kitchen in the 1790s, just before dinner was served, what would you actually see? The kitchen at Mount Vernon was a detached building, separated from the main house to reduce the risk of fire. Inside, the air was heavy with smoke, wood ash drifted in the light, and the heat from the open hearth made every breath a labor. Here, enslaved cooks like Doll and Hercules managed dozens of tasks, boiling stews in iron pots, preparing pickling brine for vegetables, and tending to bread ovens carved from brick and stone. Meals were planned not only by taste, but also by preservation. How long a thing could last in salted, dried, or pickled form before spoiling. Take squirrel stew, for instance. Squirrels, common and easily hunted, were often stewed slowly with onions, herbs, and whatever root vegetables were on hand. Not a noble dish by modern standards, but a necessary and protein-rich meal that exemplified colonial resourcefulness. Paired with thick, buttered bread and perhaps a side of boiled greens, it formed the kind of rustic meal Washington was fond of. Then there were pickled walnuts. These weren't just any nuts. Green walnuts harvested before their shells hardened were steeped in brine and then preserved in spiced vinegar. They took weeks to ferment and mellow, transforming from bitter seed pods into tangy, earthy accompaniments for roasted meats or cheese. Their taste was peculiar, a bit alien to the modern tongue, but to the colonial palate they were a cherished addition. Yet these meals weren't simply about sustenance or preference. They also reflected Washington's values: discipline, modesty, and self-reliance. Even as president, he insisted on eating seasonally. When guests from France or Britain visited expecting decadent banquets, they were instead served pumpkin dishes, smoked fish, and preserved fruits. These quiet culinary decisions shaped how others saw America, stubborn, unrefined, and proud of it. Still, beneath the simplicity was an economy of labor most guests never saw. The enslaved individuals who worked in the kitchen bore the burden of Washington's modest tastes. Preparing squirrel stew required not just catching squirrels, but skinning, cleaning, and slow cooking them for hours. Pickled walnuts required foraging in groves and days of fermentation. Nothing about the simplicity was easy. And Washington's preference for no waste meant that leftovers were repurposed or preserved, and even animal bones were boiled for broth. It's in these mundane practices, preservation, stewing, grinding corn, that we glimpse the true rhythms of early American life, not through declarations or battles, but through quiet acts of preparation. The stories of these meals offer us more than curiosity. They offer a map into how America defined itself, not just through documents and wars, but through taste and survival. And yet, one wonders, if we sat at George Washington's table today, would we recognize the meal as a reflection of freedom or of contradiction? Behind the meal, the hidden hands of history. You've imagined the table. You've pictured the food: stewed squirrel, pickled walnuts, hoe cakes browned in bacon grease. But let's step past the tablecloth and into the lives of the people who made it all happen. Because if George Washington was the face of a nation, it was the unseen, unthanked hands of enslaved laborers that fed it. One such person was Hercules, a name remembered not because the history books wished to preserve him, but because Washington's records had to list who cooked his meals. Hercules was considered one of the finest chefs in Philadelphia during Washington's presidency, and before that, he worked in Mount Vernon's kitchen. He wore crisp linen, took pride in his appearance, and navigated both heat and hardship with skill that made him invaluable. And yet he was enslaved. In that contradiction lies the complexity of America's founding kitchens, a nation yearning for liberty built on bondage. The same hand that stirred the pot also feared being sold. And yet the meals were made beautifully: roasted duck, onion-stuffed trout, ginger cakes, and they nourished not only Washington's household but also his legacy. Let's return for a moment to the food. Consider the process of preparing a single meal. First, the hunting. Small game like squirrels and rabbits were often snared by young enslaved boys sent into the woods. Their task was not simply sport, it was supply chain management, long before refrigeration. Once caught, animals had to be skinned and cleaned, delicate work that required patience, precision, and resilience. Next came the garden. Mount Vernon's garden wasn't decorative, it was tactical. Rows of cabbages, peas, beans, herbs, and potatoes grew not only for variety but for preservation. Cabbage was pickled or fermented into kraut, beans were dried and hung, potatoes stored in cool root cellars for months. Every harvest was planned around how long the ingredient could last. Then came the cooking itself. Imagine standing over an open hearth, the heat so intense your skin prickled with sweat. Large iron pots had to be moved with hooks and claws, and ash had to be swept constantly. There was no timer, no thermostat. Every dish depended on experience and instinct. You learned the doneness of cornbread by the sound of its crust crackling, or when hoe cakes released from the pan on their own. Recipes were passed down orally, with approximate measurements and careful repetition. Even desserts had their toil. Washington enjoyed preserved fruits, especially cherries and peaches. Preserving them meant soaking them in honey or sugar, sealing them in jars, and watching for spoilage. It required constant attention, just like the care required to churn butter, whip molasses, or prepare the dried apple pies that would last through winter. And the irony: Washington, while deeply respected for his modesty, often received praise for his simple dinners, as if simplicity equated to ease. But those simple meals were built on layers of preparation, multiple hands, and invisible labor. To create a plate of squirrel stew with a side of pickled walnuts and hearth-baked bread was a day's work, not a convenience. One of the most striking aspects of Washington's dining was his strict adherence to structure. Dinner was served promptly at 3 p.m. and lateness was not tolerated. Even guests of honor had to be seated when the clock struck. Meals were short, silent, and eaten with dignity. There was no loud laughter, no debating politics over meat. It was not a time for discussion. It was a ritual of quiet nourishment. So what do we learn from this section of history? That a meal is never just a meal. It's an entire ecosystem of effort: gardeners who planted the seeds, hunters who tracked the game, cooks who tested the flavor by instinct alone. And when Washington lifted his spoon, He wasn't simply tasting stew. He was consuming the labor of a dozen lives that history barely remembers. But the echoes remain. You can still find the recipes in faded letters. You can still see the soot on Mount Vernon's kitchen walls. And you can still walk through the garden where enslaved women once bent over rows of vegetables, their fingers in the dirt that would grow the next day's dinner. Which leads us to a curious question. If the food was so simple, why have we forgotten the people who made it extraordinary? The legacy of a dinner table. By now you can almost smell the stew, earthy and herbal steam rising from a blackened iron pot. You can hear the distant hiss of firewood and the clatter of pewter dishes. You know the hands that prepared the meal and the garden that bore its ingredients. But what happened to all of it? The squirrel, the walnuts, the cooks, and the culture. History, it turns out, does not preserve flavors. It preserves power. As the Revolutionary War gave way to the early Republic, George Washington's table became symbolic, less about what was served and more about what it meant. When foreign dignitaries dined at Mount Vernon, the message wasn't in lavish excess but in agricultural restraint. Washington wanted to show that the United States wasn't beholden to French sauces or British roasts. Instead, it had its own identity, one rooted in cornmeal, smoked meats, and the labor of its people. And yet slowly but surely, the foods faded. Squirrel stew, once a staple, became rustic, then ridiculed. By the 1800s, as America industrialized, canned goods replaced pickled walnuts and fresh beef overtook game. Tastes shifted toward what could be bought, not what could be foraged or preserved by hand. Hoe cakes gave way to flour-based breads, and orchard fruits were replaced by imports. Even more invisible were the people behind the meals. Enslaved cooks like Hercules and Dahl were not honored in monuments. Their recipes weren't written down in cookbooks. Their skills vanished from mainstream memory as white narratives of innovation and refinement took over. And yet their knowledge was foundational, an oral tradition of culinary survival that made Washington's simple meals possible. Today, historians and chefs are beginning to rediscover this lost world. At Mount Vernon, research has uncovered inventory lists, recipes, and kitchen layouts. Dishes like squirrel stew have been recreated not to revive them for modern palates, but to remember what they meant, not just as meals, but as maps of power, economy, and resistance. Food, after all, isn't neutral. It tells you who had time, who had labor, who had land. It tells you who had choice and who had none. So as you imagine George Washington sitting down to dinner, his silver hair powdered, his gaze steady across the table, remember the table itself. Remember the bricks of the kitchen, warmed by an open hearth. Remember the smoke on the cook's skin, the vinegar under her fingernails, the silence with which she placed the dish before a man who would never say her name in public. And then ask yourself, what did liberty taste like for her? History is often written in dates, speeches, and battles, but just as often it is cooked. In squirrel stew and pickled walnuts. In gardens you never visit and kitchens you never see. In the forgotten food served at George Washington's dinner table. How colonial housewives brewed beer for breakfast. The morning brew that shaped a nation. When you think of beer, you probably imagine taverns, tankards, and the boisterous clink of evening merriment. But in colonial America, beer was often a morning drink, poured at breakfast, offered to children, and brewed in kitchens by women who rarely appeared in history books. In fact, if you had walked into a New England farmhouse in the mid-1700s, the scent that greeted you wouldn't be of bacon or fresh bread, but of barley and hops steeping in large kettles. Colonial housewives, many of them illiterate, all of them overworked, were also brewers. Brewing beer wasn't a hobby, it was a domestic necessity. The reason? Water wasn't safe. In early American towns, wells were often shallow and polluted, especially near livestock. Boiling water helped, but beer, especially small beer, a low-alcohol brew, offered both hydration and nutrients. It was safer than water, more filling than milk, and easier to preserve than fruit juices. Children drank it, laborers relied on it, and nearly every household had someone responsible for making it. That someone was usually a woman. Brewing began at dawn. Barley, or sometimes corn or oats, was soaked and sprouted to form malt, then dried. This malt was mashed in hot water to extract sugars. The resulting liquid, called wort, was boiled with bitter herbs or hops, then cooled and fermented in wooden barrels. The process took days, and every step demanded attention: the heat of the fire, the cleanliness of the cask, the timing of the fermentation. Even more, beer had to be monitored constantly for spoilage. Insects, wild yeasts, and poor storage could ruin a batch. And a spoiled batch wasn't just a loss of drink, it was a loss of time, calories, and reputation. A good housewife was known by her beer. It was one of the few things colonial men openly judged and praised in domestic life. Some women became so skilled at brewing that their beer was sold at markets or supplied to inns. In cities like Philadelphia and Boston, widows often turned to brewing as a means of income. One such woman, Mary Lyle of Pennsylvania, is considered the first recorded female brewer in America, taking over her father's brewhouse in the 1730s. But even rural women with no access to formal markets took pride in their brews. Recipes were guarded, often passed down orally from mother to daughter. Flavoring agents varied: molasses, ginger, spruce tips, sassafras. Some beers were thick and dark, others light and sour. But most shared two qualities: they were weak in alcohol and they were vital to survival. And beer wasn't limited to special occasions. It was served with every meal: breakfast, lunch, and dinner. At breakfast, beer might accompany porridge or bread. Laborers working in fields would take bottles with them, often wrapped in cloth to stay cool. Even children drank small beer, usually containing less than 2% alcohol. It was considered healthier than water, and its mild fermentation was thought to ease digestion. But this daily routine carried weight. The woman brewing the beer had to gather the ingredients, stoke the fire, time the mash, monitor fermentation, clean the equipment, and store the results, all while raising children, tending gardens, sewing clothes, and preserving food for winter. Beer was just one more task in an endless list of unpaid labor that sustained the household. And yet brewing was a science, even if it wasn't seen that way. Colonial women understood the principles of fermentation long before Louis Pasteur explained them. They learned how yeast worked by observing bubbles. They knew the signs of contamination. They learned what temperature was just right by holding their hands near a pot. It was instinct, refined by years of experience. So when you think about the founding of America, think not just of powdered wigs and parchment documents, but of the quiet labor of women standing over boiling kettles in smoke-filled kitchens. Their beer fed soldiers, nourished children, and kept households alive through drought, war, and harsh winters. And yet, history rarely raises a glass in their name. Which raises a question. If beer was so central to colonial life, why have we forgotten the hands that brewed it? Brewing, gender, and the rise of commercial power. The morning beer, warm and low in alcohol, was more than just a drink. It was a symbol of feminine mastery over one of the most crucial resources in a colonial home. But as American society expanded and industries grew, something quiet and transformative began to happen. The knowledge that had long belonged to women started slipping away. In the 1600s and early 1700s, homebrewing was firmly a woman's domain. It was considered a chore, just like churning butter or baking bread. The idea that beer was man's work would have felt absurd to a colonial family relying on the brew kettle maintained by the mother. But by the mid-1700s, and especially after the Revolution, brewing began to shift, gradually and then decisively, into male hands. Why? Commerce. As cities expanded and taverns became formalized, the demand for mass quantities of beer surged. Male entrepreneurs, many of them immigrants from beer cultures in Germany and the British Isles, established larger brewhouses and imported new techniques, barrels, and equipment. Beer became business, and with it came new status. Once beer began generating revenue beyond the home, women were pushed out. What had once been unpaid domestic labor became monetized, and therefore masculinized. In journals and advertisements, brewer quickly shifted from a domestic description of a woman's task to a formal occupation reserved for men. In just a few decades, the identity of the American brewer was rewritten. And yet the knowledge remained the same. The techniques used in early commercial breweries were strikingly similar to what housewives had done in their kitchens. The scale had changed, but the core process hadn't. This transition reveals a deeper story about history. The moment something becomes economically valuable, it's often taken from women and placed under male authority. Even the language shifted. Where once women had been praised in their communities for strong or clean beer, now they were quietly erased from brewing literature. Brewers' manuals, which emerged in the late 18th century, spoke only to men. Recipes were codified, printed, and sold, no longer passed down orally at the fireside. Some women resisted. In rural areas, homebrewing continued well into the 1800s, especially where store-bought beer was rare or expensive. Mothers taught daughters how to malt barley, test water, and identify healthy yeast by smell and foam. But the cultural value was gone. Brewing, once a respected task of daily survival, was now viewed as old-fashioned at best and backward at worst. There's also another layer to consider: race and class. Enslaved women, especially in Southern households, also brewed beer. They often used sorghum or maize in place of barley and had to improvise with available herbs. Their beer might be used in the main house or kept for their own communities within enslaved quarters. These women, too, were erased. Their brewing knowledge, entirely separate from European methods, rarely made it into written records. Even among free women, class determined who could keep brewing. Wealthier women abandoned the brew kettle when store-bought or tavern beer became available. Poorer women, especially in rural areas or frontier settlements, brewed because they had no other choice. The task remained, but the prestige vanished. As industrialization swept through the 19th century, large breweries began mechanizing fermentation. Steam power, refrigeration, and bottling transformed beer into a product rather than a practice. And by the time the 20th century arrived, most Americans associated beer not with breakfast or domestic life, but with barrooms, brands, and breweries bearing German or Irish surnames. So what happened to the recipes? Some survive in fragments scribbled in cookbooks, preserved in family Bibles, or written in margin notes. Others exist only as cultural memory, descriptions in letters, journals, and travelers' observations. A few historical societies have begun to reconstruct them, curious about the flavors of early America. But the women who created these beers remain mostly anonymous. They brewed in silence, not for recognition but for necessity. They measured with instinct, timed with touch, and passed their knowledge not through books but through practice. And maybe that's why we don't remember them. Because to history, work done in the home, especially by women, often vanishes unless it's written down, monetized, or associated with a famous name. So the next time you see a bottle of craft beer, with its bold label and carefully calibrated hops, consider its distant ancestor, brewed by hand in a smoky kitchen before dawn, served with porridge to a child, and forgotten by time. But we might ask ourselves this: when something once so essential becomes invisible, how much of our history is brewed, but never bottled? Rediscovering the forgotten flavors of domestic history. Let's sit now in the calm of evening and imagine an ordinary colonial home. A stone hearth still warm from the morning fire, wooden barrels resting in a corner, a child finishing supper, his lips damp from a sip of small beer, the scent of fermenting malt hanging gently in the air. It's not a dramatic scene. It's not etched into national memory, But in that ordinary moment lies the heartbeat of early American life. As America changed, so too did its attitude toward tradition. Beer, once an essential domestic product made by the hands of countless women, became industrial, commercial, and masculine. The flavors shifted, the language shifted, the story, as we've seen, shifted too. But some things remained. Even into the 19th century, women in rural areas, especially in parts of Appalachia, New England, and the Midwest, continued to brew, not as an act of nostalgia, but as a quiet rebellion against dependency. Where transportation was limited and money was scarce, homebrewing persisted. A barrel of small beer might sit in the cellar beside jars of preserved peaches and salted pork. Brewing was still survival. And today, something unexpected is happening. Those traditions are being recovered. In recent years, historians, chefs, and experimental brewers have begun seeking out colonial beer recipes. Some are pulled from crumbling cookbooks. Others are reconstructed from letters or old tavern records. And still others are the result of archaeological digs, where traces of fermenting equipment are found in old homesteads, suggesting the steady rhythm of domestic brewing long since forgotten. One of the most fascinating discoveries isn't a single recipe, but a pattern. Colonial women rarely brewed the same way twice. Each batch reflected the seasons, the grains available, and the subtle shifts in temperature or water quality. They adjusted on the fly. If hops were scarce, they used bitter herbs. If malt was low, they substituted with molasses or parched corn. Their beer was a living document, written in taste, not ink. And this is perhaps the most beautiful part of the legacy: adaptability. These women didn't have thermometers. They didn't have precision scales. What they had were senses, taste, smell, intuition, and a relationship with their ingredients that bordered on the sacred. In a way, their brewing was both science and survival, art and necessity. But recovering this history isn't just about nostalgia. It's about restoring balance. For centuries, the narrative of American brewing has centered on men, on taverns, brands, and commercial success. But when we pull back the veil, we see the truth. That for much of American history, beer began with women. It was brewed for families, served at the breakfast table, and shaped by hands that were never honored for their craft. And so, we arrive at the quiet question behind this story. What do we lose when we forget the people behind our daily rituals? A breakfast beer may seem strange to us now, but in that morning mug was a world of knowledge, passed down, worn into the rhythm of life, and poured with care by someone who likely never imagined her work would matter to history. But it did, because history isn't just made by presidents and proclamations. Sometimes it's brewed in silence. Indian pudding and the politics of American identity. A colonial dessert that tried to replace British custard. Before apple pie claimed its title as quintessentially American, there was another dish served in households from Massachusetts to Virginia: Indian pudding. Thick, dark, and slow-cooked, this humble dessert told a far bigger story than its sticky texture suggested. It was more than food. It was identity. Let's go back to the 1700s. The colonies were still tethered to Britain politically and culturally. English customs dominated from fashion to religion to diet. And in that diet, no dish was more beloved than hasty pudding, a soft wheat porridge sweetened with milk and sugar, served as a breakfast, side dish, or dessert. It was easy, quick, and English. But in the New World, wheat was expensive. Sugar was a luxury. Milk spoiled quickly. The ingredients just didn't suit the land. So colonists adapted. They replaced wheat with something more abundant: ground maize, or Indian meal, as it was commonly called. They added molasses instead of refined sugar and cooked the pudding slowly in brick ovens, sometimes for hours. The result was something new, not as delicate as the British version, but denser, heartier, and distinctly American. And so, Indian pudding was born. The name itself is a window into the colonial mindset. Indian, didn't refer to Native American cuisine. It was shorthand for anything made from cornmeal, the grain that indigenous people had introduced to colonists. This naming, both grateful and dismissive, reveals much about the early American identity, a culture built on adaptation, yet quick to erase the source of its survival. Still, Indian pudding took hold. It became a staple in New England kitchens. Recipes varied, some added cinnamon, ginger, or raisins. Others relied on a splash of cream or a handful of dried apples. But the core ingredients stayed the same: cornmeal, milk, molasses, and thyme. Because Indian pudding wasn't fast, it was anything but hasty. Where the British version was boiled in minutes, Indian pudding took hours to bake. It required patience, a steady oven, and a cook who knew how to balance flavor with heat. It became a dish of contemplation, made in the morning, eaten at night. Warm, filling, and often accompanied by a dollop of cream or, much later, a scoop of ice cream. And yet, this simple dessert became political. As tensions with Britain grew, colonists began rejecting British goods, not just tea and textiles, but also wheat and white sugar. Indian pudding, once a substitution born of scarcity, became a symbol of resistance. It was American not only in flavor, but in principle. By choosing it, colonists could assert independence, embrace local ingredients, and reject the luxuries of an empire they no longer wished to serve. In letters and journals, the dish is mentioned with pride. It was served at patriot meetings, on Independence Day celebrations, and in homes where rebellion simmered alongside molasses pots. One Boston matron famously claimed that she'd never again serve custard while British ships floated in the harbor. This dessert, thick, brown, and unglamorous, was now revolutionary. But even as it became a national symbol, it remained rooted in domestic life. Indian pudding was still made by women, still stirred slowly in hearthside kitchens, still baked in clay or cast iron pots. Its transformation from a frugal substitution to a culinary declaration didn't change who made it or how much labor it required. And in that tension, between symbolism and effort, we begin to see the fuller picture. Because history often celebrates the things we choose to represent us, but not always the hands that create them. So next time you imagine colonial resistance, don't just think of powdered wigs and bold speeches. Think of a woman in an apron, stirring cornmeal into warm milk, glancing toward the firelight, her spoon moving with quiet certainty. She wasn't writing the Declaration of Independence. She was baking it. Which leads us to wonder, when we say a dish is American, what do we really mean? A nation rising on cornmeal and molasses. By the mid-18th century, Indian pudding was no longer just a humble kitchen staple. It was a declaration of cultural independence, ladled onto pewter plates with quiet conviction. As the Revolutionary War approached, the dish took on new meaning. It wasn't merely about nutrition or necessity. It was about who Americans believed they were and who they refused to be. In fact, the ingredients themselves carried messages. Molasses, for example, was a key symbol in the colonies. Imported from the West Indies, it was cheaper than sugar and more readily available. But it was also political. British taxes on sugar and molasses, the Sugar Act of 1764, in particular, sparked outrage in the colonies. Using molasses in everyday food then became a way of embracing what was local, accessible, and rebellious. Cornmeal, too, was a product of the land, native to the Americas and crucial to colonial survival. Indigenous communities had long used corn in every imaginable form, ash-treated for nixtamalization, ground into grits, or cooked into cakes and porridges. European settlers had learned from them, borrowed their knowledge, adapted it to their needs, and then repackaged it in terms that erased the origin. Indian pudding carried the memory of that erasure. The name acknowledged indigenous influence but distanced itself from indigenous people. As the new nation formed, it embraced the idea of a native grain but not the native communities. That contradiction sat quietly on the dinner table, unnoticed by most, as families passed around steaming bowls of dark, spiced pudding. At the same time, cookbooks began to emerge. The first American cookbooks were deeply rooted in practicality, filled with recipes that emphasized frugality, local ingredients, and adaptability. Indian pudding was a mainstay. It was simple to make, forgiving in flavor, and perfectly suited to the limitations of early American kitchens. Its inclusion in these texts helped solidify its place in American culinary identity. But not all households experienced it the same way. In wealthier homes, Indian pudding might be flavored with nutmeg, drizzled with cream, or served alongside stewed fruits. In poorer homes, it was thicker, sometimes even sliced and fried the next day. And in enslaved quarters on southern plantations, cornmeal porridge took on other forms, still vital, still sustaining, but prepared without fanfare or praise. Yet in public memory, it was the New England version that prevailed. Indian pudding became associated with the stoic, self-reliant Yankee spirit, a food that symbolized grit, modesty, and endurance. It appeared at community dinners, Thanksgiving celebrations, and town gatherings. For many, it was comfort food. For others, it was heritage. Still, the labor behind it remained largely invisible. To make Indian pudding well required time, attention, and skill. It had to be stirred constantly as it thickened, lest it clump or burn. It had to bake slowly, often for hours, in a low oven or brick hearth. The pudding had to be watched, tested, and tasted. It wasn't difficult to prepare, but it was demanding. And once again, this labor was done primarily by women. They stirred and poured and ladled. They served without credit. They preserved a culinary tradition that, even as it became part of the American myth, never acknowledged the hands that sustained it. By the early 1800s, Indian pudding was considered old-fashioned. Tastes had begun to change. The nation was industrializing. Imported sweets became more affordable. Wheat was more accessible. Custards returned. Cakes with refined flour and sugar came into fashion. Indian pudding, once symbolic of rebellion, became something rural, something people ate not out of patriotism, but out of habit. And yet it lingered. Even today, Indian pudding appears in obscure corners of New England diners, on Thanksgiving menus that favor tradition, or in recreations of colonial meals at living history museums. It's no longer political. It's nostalgic. But the story it carries, the transformation of a British dish into an American one, the erasure of indigenous knowledge, the labor of women unrecorded, is still baked into every bite. So as we sit quietly in the flickering light of a colonial hearth, watching that pudding rise and darken, we might ask, was this dessert really about sweetness or survival? The slow disappearance of a national dish. By the 20th century, Indian pudding had all but vanished from most American kitchens. The dessert that once symbolized rebellion, adaptation, and local resilience was now seen as old-fashioned, something too dense, too plain, too brown. In a nation hurtling toward fast food and convenience, Indian pudding was too slow to survive. Its ingredients, cornmeal, molasses, milk, were no longer symbols of pride, but reminders of rural poverty or outdated customs. American taste had changed. People wanted lighter desserts, sweeter ones. The rise of gelatin molds, boxed cake mixes, and refrigerated pies pushed Indian pudding off the plate and into memory. Even so, a few voices tried to preserve it. In the 1940s and 50s, historical societies and New England inns began reviving Indian pudding as part of authentic colonial dining experiences. It was served in pewter bowls, often alongside roast meats and cranberry sauce, meant to transport guests back in time. But this was reenactment, not remembrance. The pudding had become a performance. The labor behind it, female, indigenous, enslaved, was not part of the show. What's more, most modern versions of Indian pudding changed the recipe. Some replaced molasses with brown sugar. Others added eggs for lightness. A few even included flour, betraying the original intention of using cornmeal alone. The dish had become stylized, sanitized, a softened echo of the hard work and adaptation it once represented. Today, Indian pudding survives in fragments. You can still find it on menus at a few traditional restaurants in New England, mostly tourist spots in Massachusetts or Maine. It occasionally appears in cookbooks aimed at historical recreation, but it's a curiosity now, a relic. And yet there's value in remembering it, because Indian pudding isn't just a dessert, it's a map. A map of how food evolves under pressure, how scarcity creates innovation. A map of how cultures borrow, blend, and erase. A map of how gender and labor shape the meals we call national. And perhaps most importantly, it's a reminder that identity isn't just formed in documents or wars. It's stirred in pots, poured into molds, and baked in ovens by people whose names we don't know. There's an irony in the fact that Indian pudding is so hard to describe to modern palates. It's not cake, it's not porridge, it's too thick to drink, too soft to slice. It resists easy definition, just like the nation that adopted it, and perhaps that's the point. Because American history, too, is not always sweet or simple. It's dense, complex, full of forgotten ingredients. And sometimes, it takes a long, slow heat to bring out the truth. So if you ever come across Indian pudding on a menu in a book or in a memory, don't just taste it. Ask what it meant to the people who made it. The woman stirring by the fire, the farmer harvesting corn, the enslaved cook working without rest, the daughter watching and learning. Because sometimes the most boring food on the table is the one that tells you everything. Salt cod in silence, the dinner etiquette of early America. Meals without conversation in the age of manners. Imagine sitting at a long wooden table in a candle-lit room. The scent of boiled cabbage mingles with dried fish. Your hands are folded neatly. Your back is straight. You are hungry, but you wait. The host lifts his fork then, and only then can you eat. You chew quietly. You don't speak. And no one else does either. Welcome to dinner in early America. Contrary to the romanticized image of raucous taverns or lively family gatherings, formal meals in 18th century America, especially in upper and middle-class households, were defined by restraint. Silence was considered virtuous. Speaking during meals, especially idle chatter, was seen as uncivilized, childish, or even sinful. This was a time when etiquette wasn't just preference, it was moral instruction. Drawing from European traditions, particularly British and Puritan influences, American colonists believed in moderation in all things: speech, appetite, emotion. A meal was a time of reflection, not discussion. And so it was that hundreds of families sat down each night to quietly consume dishes like salt cod, bean porridge, turnip mash, and boiled meats without uttering a word. Let's talk about the food itself. Salt cod was a staple. Why? Because it kept. Imported from Newfoundland or the Caribbean, salt cod could be preserved for months, even years when kept dry. It was soaked in water to remove the salt, then boiled or baked, usually without seasoning beyond butter or onion. It was affordable, versatile, and available long after fresh fish had spoiled. In fact, during winter months, it might be the only protein on the table. But it wasn't exactly exciting. Salt cod was functional, not flavorful. Like many foods of the time, it served a purpose, fuel, not pleasure. The same could be said for much of early American cuisine. Dishes were boiled, mashed, salted, preserved. The goal was sustenance, not novelty. Flavors were mild. Textures were soft. The seasoning of choice was often restraint. This simplicity mirrored the moral values of the time. Children were taught strict table manners from a young age. Forks were used cautiously. Elbows never touched the table. Napkins were folded in precise ways. Talking with your mouth full was not just impolite, it was considered disgraceful. And for some communities, particularly Puritans, meals were opportunities to model spiritual discipline. Prayers were said not just before meals, but sometimes after every course. And yet these quiet meals were anything but meaningless. They were structured, ritualized. Every gesture at the table reflected broader social order, who had authority, who had patience, who knew their place. To speak out of turn at the table was to disrupt not just dinner, but the values underpinning the household. The silence also reflected deeper anxieties. In an era before antibiotics or refrigeration, food was always a risk. A spoiled dish could mean illness. Overeating could bring discomfort in a world without reliable medicine. And so meals became cautious affairs. Simplicity wasn't just moral, it was practical. Still, not every table was the same. In enslaved quarters, mealtimes looked very different. Silence was often enforced, but for entirely different reasons: control, fear, exhaustion. Meals there were rushed, plain, and eaten in shadows. Meanwhile, in poorer white households or among frontier families, etiquette was looser, more driven by hunger than propriety. But in formal homes, in towns like Boston, Charleston, and Philadelphia, etiquette ruled. And dinner was more than a meal. It was a performance of civility. As odd as it may seem now, this culture of restraint helped define early American values. Simplicity was virtue. Conversation was reserved for after dinner. And salt cod, dry, unremarkable, yet nourishing, became a symbol of enduring discipline. So the next time you think of a family meal, picture not laughter or storytelling, but the quiet clink of cutlery, the faint scrape of a spoon against ceramic, and the long silence that echoed louder than any word. Because sometimes, in early America, silence was the loudest form of manners. But here's a question worth pondering. When did silence stop being a virtue and start feeling like a loss? The rules beneath the table, social order, and everyday control. By the 18th century, the American dinner table had become a miniature reflection of the wider society. Beneath the polished surface of etiquette and grace lay a structured web of control, over behavior, over conversation, over who sat where and ate what. Meals were not just about food, they were about hierarchy. At the head of the table sat the patriarch, usually the father, employer, or landowner, whose actions determined when the meal began and ended. His fork was the cue. No one touched their plate until he did. Across from him sat the matriarch, who may have planned the meal, instructed the servants, or even cooked it herself in smaller households, but rarely spoke during it. Children had assigned places. Their hands were expected to remain still when not eating. They were to chew quietly, swallow completely before speaking, if allowed to speak at all, and never request more than what was given. Complaints about food were forbidden. Even praise could be seen as disruptive if spoken too casually or loudly. Servants and enslaved individuals, those who cooked, carried, and cleared the meals, were never part of this performance. They were expected to remain invisible, efficient, and silent. In wealthier households, enslaved cooks or domestic workers might stand against the wall, waiting to refill water or remove plates, without being acknowledged by name. Their labor fed the ritual, but their presence was intentionally minimized. And it wasn't just adults imposing silence. Etiquette manuals of the period, small handbooks often titled things like The Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior, instructed children as young as 5 on how to behave at the table. These guides were not light reading. They listed rules like: spit not in the room but in the corner. Pick not your teeth with your knife. Drink not with your mouth full. Speak not at the table unless spoken to. In these lessons, manners weren't just politeness, they were discipline. They were a means to train the body and mind, to mold citizens who could govern themselves and eventually a nation. George Washington famously copied down 110 such rules in his youth, and scholars often cite these as foundational to his sense of self-control and leadership. The food itself reinforced this structure. Salt cod, boiled potatoes, mushy peas, root vegetables. These were not indulgent or sensory meals. They were quiet foods, steamed rather than fried, bland rather than spiced. They produced little sound when eaten, little smell when served, and little joy when consumed. They were practical, moral, humble, ideal for a society that believed too much pleasure was dangerous. Even desserts followed suit. A basic apple tart, sweetened with a modest bit of honey or molasses, was more common than cakes or custards. Spices like cinnamon or nutmeg were expensive and used sparingly. The goal was modest pleasure, just enough to signal reward but not enough to invite gluttony. And yet underneath all this control, people were still people. Letters from the era occasionally reveal moments of quiet rebellion. A young girl sneaking extra apple slices under the table. A servant rolling their eyes behind a guest, back. A father pretending not to notice his child's fingers dipped in pudding. These moments were rare, but they remind us that behind the stiff rules was a very human struggle between order and impulse. Interestingly, as cities grew and the middle class expanded, these rigid dining rules began to fray. Taverns, public houses where food and drink were shared, became spaces of conversation, debate, even rowdiness. They were loud by design, a stark contrast to the silence of domestic meals. And in those taverns, salt cod appeared too, but fried, stewed, or mixed with other ingredients. It lost its quiet identity and became food for conversation. There, the cod might be served with a pint of beer and a political argument, its taste now colored by noise. So we're left with a curious contrast, the same fish but two very different meals, one silent and ritualized, one public and lively, the same society with vastly different ideas of what a meal should be. Which raises an important thought. Was etiquette a tool for civilization, or a cage built to keep emotions in check? When the silence broke, changing tastes and table culture. By the 19th century, the long silence of the early American dinner table began to loosen. The Industrial Revolution was changing how people worked, lived, and ate. Cities swelled, time grew scarce, and rigid etiquette began to soften under the pressures of practicality and progress. The meal, once a solemn ceremony, started to resemble something more familiar to us today. A time to talk, to share, to connect. Salt cod, too, changed. Once a symbol of restraint and endurance, it slowly faded from the center of the plate. Refrigeration, faster transportation, and the growing availability of fresh meats made salt-preserved fish less essential. Where once it had defined American winter diets, it was now a relic of poorer times. In middle-class homes, it became associated with thrift, not choice. For some, it even became embarrassing, a sign of old-fashioned or immigrant habits. Still, it lingered. In Catholic communities, especially among Irish and Portuguese immigrants, salt cod remained a staple during Lent, when meat was forbidden. These groups adapted the dish to their own traditions, baking it with onions, tomatoes, or cream. Suddenly, the same food once eaten in silent Protestant kitchens became part of vibrant, expressive meals served with song, laughter, and prayer. But perhaps the most striking transformation was not in the fish, but in the soundscape of the meal. As Victorian values took hold in the mid-1800s, conversation during meals became not only acceptable but expected, especially among the rising middle class. Books and magazines now instructed women on how to host engaging dinner parties, how to guide polite discussion, and how to use the table as a stage for charm and intellect. Quietness, once a virtue, became awkward. This shift in etiquette reflected broader changes in American life. People had more leisure. Meals grew longer, more elaborate, more performative. The fork replaced the spoon as the dominant utensil. Multiple courses became the norm in formal settings. Napkin rings, finger bowls, and decorative tablecloths entered the scene. The meal was still structured, but now it encouraged talk, not silence. And as dinner conversation grew, so did the space for emotional life. Families began using meals as a time to check in, to debate, to laugh. The stoic dinner of the 1700s gave way to something warmer. It wasn't always idealized. There were still rules, still power dynamics, but the silence had cracked, and through it came humanity. Looking back, it's tempting to romanticize the quiet dignity of those early meals. The candlelight, the discipline, the sense of order. But there's something haunting about that silence too, something that speaks to a culture afraid of excess, emotion, or even the sound of its own appetite. Salt cod is still eaten today, of course. In places like the Azores, Puerto Rico, and coastal Canada, it's honored as tradition. In parts of New England, it reappears on nostalgic holiday menus. And in upscale restaurants, it's sometimes reimagined, whipped into brandade or served in croquettes, elevated far beyond its humble beginnings. But rarely does it return to the silence of its first American tables. Because today we eat differently, not just in ingredients but in intention. We eat to connect, to celebrate, to feel. So the next time you sit down to a meal, with the clink of silverware and the murmur of voices around you, remember that it wasn't always like this. There was a time when dinner meant no talking, when fish was dry and unsalted emotion was the rule. A time when a quiet room was the sign of a well-raised child and a respected host. And maybe, just maybe, a time when too much was left unsaid. Boiled peanuts and baked eels, foods enslaved cooks prepared. The invisible chefs of the American South. In the grand plantation kitchens of the antebellum South, where copper pots gleamed and spices were kept under lock and key, some of the most skilled chefs in the country worked in silence. They were not professionally trained. Their names rarely appeared in cookbooks, but the meals they prepared, boiled peanuts, baked eels, pepper pot stew, sweet yam pies, would shape the very soul of Southern cuisine. These cooks were enslaved, and their contributions for generations were consumed but not credited. Walk into a plantation kitchen in the 1830s, and you'd find heat, real, oppressive heat from the wood-fired hearth. You'd smell garlic and onions sizzling in lard, okra simmering with tomatoes, and cornbread rising in cast-iron pans. In the background, you might hear the rhythmic chopping of collard or the low bubbling of peanut stew. The kitchen was not quiet, but the voices of its creators were rarely heard beyond its walls. These cooks were often women, passed over by history but central to survival. Their role was paradoxical. They were forced to nourish the very people who enslaved them. They woke before dawn, cooked multiple meals each day, and adapted European dishes to local ingredients and African techniques. Their labor was exploited, yet their knowledge was profound. One such ingredient was the humble peanut. Originally from South America but cultivated widely in Africa, peanuts made their way to the American South through the transatlantic slave trade. Enslaved people already knew how to cook them, roasting them in shells, grinding them into stews, or boiling them with salt until soft and earthy. Boiled peanuts became a staple food, cheap, filling, and deeply tied to African culinary memory. Another was eel. Often caught in rivers and swamps near southern plantations, eels were abundant but dismissed by elite white diners. They were seen as low food, slippery and unrefined. But enslaved cooks knew better. Eels could be cleaned, seasoned, and slow-baked into dishes that were rich in protein and full of flavor. Eel pie, eel stew, even smoked eel. All were part of a quiet culinary tradition passed from one generation to the next. And then there were greens, collard, mustards, turnips, boiled with pork fat or smoked turkey, seasoned with vinegar or pepper flakes. These weren't simply side dishes, they were survival food. Packed with nutrients, affordable to grow, and endlessly adaptable. The knowledge of how to prepare them, when to pick, how long to simmer, what to serve them with, came from African knowledge systems, applied with creativity under duress. These meals were rarely written down. Recipes were held in memory, refined by experience and shared through observation. A child might watch her mother thicken gravy with cornmeal, or taste the stew and know it needed more smoked salt. Cooking was both necessity and inheritance, one of the few legacies an enslaved family could pass on. Despite their skill, these cooks had no rights over their creations. When plantation owners entertained guests, they boasted about the food but never mentioned who made it. A slave named Emily might have roasted the pheasant to perfection, or a man named Joe might have spent hours grinding pepper for a stew. But the compliments were directed at the host, not the hands. And yet these meals told a story. A story of forced labor and stolen credit, but also of cultural resilience, of dishes that blended African techniques with American ingredients, of foods like fried okra, gumbo, red rice, and beni cakes, all born in the crucible of injustice, yet enduring long after slavery ended. As you picture that kitchen, its smoke, its movement, its quiet excellence, you may wonder, how many national cuisines were built by people who were never allowed to call the dishes their own? Recipes without names, cooks without credit. In the plantations of the American South, the kitchen was both a workplace and a battlefield. For enslaved cooks, it was where survival and identity took shape, not just through endurance but through innovation. They created dishes from scraps. They turned overlooked ingredients into delicacies. They made something from nothing and fed entire households without ever owning the food they made. The recipes didn't come from books. They came from memory, from watching, tasting, adjusting. In the hush of dawn, before the plantation house awoke, a cook might begin boiling peanuts, harvested the day before, salted generously, and left to simmer for hours. They had no timers. They judged readiness by color, texture, smell. And once the peanuts softened just right, they were ladled into wooden bowls for breakfast, snacks, or rations. The same went for eels. Slippery and difficult to clean, eels required skill to prepare. Enslaved men often caught them with traps in rivers, then brought them to the kitchen where women cleaned them with ash, rubbed them in salt, and baked them in tightly sealed pans to preserve moisture. Sometimes a thick cornbread crust sealed the dish, part protection, part meal. And yet, despite this mastery, the cooks remained nameless. Visitors to plantations often wrote about the food in glowing terms. One traveler to South Carolina in the 1840s described the most astonishingly seasoned okra stew, noting its flavor was rich without excess. Another mentioned the dark molasses pie with nut crusts, tender and strange, calling it a delicacy unmatched in the North. But they never asked who cooked it, or if they did, the names were never printed. What these travelers missed was that the food they ate, so carefully seasoned, so deeply satisfying, was not random. It came from cultural memory. It came from Africa. The techniques used by enslaved cooks, slow simmering, layering spices, using smoked meats, were rooted in West African traditions. Peanut stews, yam-based pies, greens with vinegar and heat. These were reinterpretations of ancestral dishes, made possible with American ingredients. This culinary translation was an act of resistance. Enslaved people had no power to own land, protect family, or control their bodies. But through food, they preserved something that could not be taken, their knowledge. And they passed it on, silently but powerfully, through every meal. Even the act of flavoring was an assertion of humanity. In a system built to break spirit and erase identity, flavor was freedom. A little cayenne in a stew, a few cloves in a pudding, the precise ratio of lard to flour in a crust, these were not just decisions, they were declarations. That taste still mattered. That skill still lived. That a culture could survive even when enslaved. After emancipation, many formerly enslaved cooks went on to become paid household staff, caterers, and restaurateurs, though often still without recognition. Some eventually published cookbooks, but most remained anonymous. The legacy of their food passed invisibly from generation to generation, forming the backbone of what we now call Southern cooking. And today, that legacy is everywhere. In dishes like shrimp and grits, in gumbo, in sweet potato pie, in hush puppies, collard greens, and even barbecue. These are not just regional favorites, they are chapters of a hidden culinary history. But how often do we name the cooks behind them? As we eat, we celebrate the flavor, the comfort, the nostalgia, but forget the hands that made these foods necessary in the first place. The hands that worked 16-hour days, endured impossible pain, and still stirred, seasoned, and served. So perhaps the next time you bite into a dish born of the South, ask not just what it is, but who it remembers. Because recipes may survive without names. A culinary legacy etched in fire and memory. By the end of the Civil War, the kitchens of the American South had already left behind more than just the scent of simmering stews. They had seeded a culinary tradition so deeply rooted, so intimately familiar, that it would shape the American table forever. But still, the names of those who created it remained largely unwritten. Freedom brought change, but not erasure of struggle. Formerly enslaved cooks found new roles in society. Some stayed on as domestic workers, continuing to cook in the same kitchens but now with minimal pay instead of none. Others opened boarding houses and small kitchens, where they cooked familiar dishes for travelers, laborers, and freed communities. Their food, often the only legacy they could openly claim, became their currency, their language, and in rare cases, their livelihood. Yet public recognition was elusive. Many of these women and some men served hundreds each day from their porches or roadside carts, selling pies, fried fish, stewed beans, and boiled peanuts to people who might never know their names. A few figures did rise into visibility, like Abby Fisher, an emancipated woman who published What Mrs. Fisher Knows About Old Southern Cooking in 1881. But most remained faceless in the historical record. The food, however, did not. Benny wafers, okra gumbo, red rice, sweet potato pudding, black-eyed peas. These dishes are now firmly embedded in the canon of American cooking. They grace the tables of holidays, family reunions, diners, and even five-star restaurants. But their origin stories are rarely told. And when they are, they're often framed around Southern tradition, bypassing the brutal history that created them. It's not just a loss of credit, it's a loss of context. Without understanding who prepared these meals and under what conditions, we reduce them to comfort food. But comfort for whom? These dishes were born not from ease, but from necessity, from knowledge carried across oceans, and from strength forged in captivity. Boiled peanuts, once a survival snack, are now sold at gas stations and ballparks. Baked eel, once a practical use of unwanted catch, has largely disappeared but survives in African American cookbooks and coastal traditions. Both were once ordinary. Today, they're cultural artifacts, quiet reminders of a past not yet fully acknowledged. Some chefs today are working to change that. Black culinary historians and food scholars like Michael W. Twitty, Tony Tipton Martin, and Adrian Miller are documenting the stories, restoring the voices, and reclaiming the recipes. They dig through church archives, plantation records, oral histories, and faded cookbooks to recover what was never meant to be forgotten. And in doing so, they remind us of something essential, that food is not neutral. It's a vessel of memory. A spoonful of stewed okra holds centuries of adaptation. A pie crust crimped just so recalls the muscle memory of hands long gone. The smell of molasses, the snap of collard in a hot pan, the slow softening of peanuts in salted water, these are not just sensations. They are inheritances. So next time you taste something called soul food, ask where the soul came from. Because the kitchens of enslaved cooks were not just sites of labor, they were archives, laboratories, sanctuaries, resistance spaces. And even though the world outside those kitchens often denied them voice, their food has spoken across centuries. Spoken of endurance, spoken of knowledge, spoken of people who were never meant to be remembered, but are still feeding us. the kitchen garden of the first president, seeds of power and the politics of parsley. Mount Vernon may be remembered for its white portico, its stately columns, and the man who slept in every room but one. But tucked just behind the mansion, past the formal lawns and slave quarters, was a garden, not ornamental but practical. This was the kitchen garden, and for George Washington, it was a space of intention, labor, and quiet strategy. You might not think of parsley as political, or of beets, lettuce, or cabbage, but in 18th century America, growing your own food was an act of identity. It meant control over sustenance. It meant knowledge of land and weather. It meant preparation in times of war, drought, or economic strain. For Washington, the garden was not a hobby. It was a map of survival. The kitchen garden at Mount Vernon spanned nearly 4 acres. It was enclosed by a low stone wall and divided into neat geometric beds. These beds were not filled with flowers. They were planted with dozens of varieties of vegetables, herbs, and fruits: onions, radishes, spinach, carrots, peas, leeks, cucumbers, and kale. Some were native. Others came from Europe or the West Indies. All were carefully recorded by Washington and his estate managers. And all were grown by enslaved labor. The garden's planning was overseen by Washington, but its daily work, planting, weeding, harvesting, was done by enslaved men and women. They tilled the soil, hauled compost, watered by hand, and picked pests from leaves. Their hands knew the texture of Mount Vernon's dirt better than anyone's, yet their names were rarely attached to the lush rows of thriving plants. The produce from this garden fed the household, the guests, and even the estate's workers. It also offered a kind of insurance. During the Revolutionary War, when imports were disrupted and British goods were boycotted, gardens like this one ensured food security. They became symbols of American self-sufficiency. Washington took immense pride in his garden's productivity. He documented crop yields, experimented with plant rotation, and ordered seeds from Europe to test against local varieties. In letters, he compared the flavor of different cabbages, described the growth rates of beans, and even commented on the pest resistance of specific herbs. This wasn't vanity, it was strategy. He understood that a secure republic needed a secure food source. The agricultural backbone of early America wasn't wheat or tobacco, it was the humble kitchen garden. Every leaf of kale, every bunch of chives, every cluster of red currants was part of a larger philosophy, that freedom required self-reliance. Still, not all freedom was equal. While Washington wrote passionately about soil drainage and compost methods, the people who did the labor remained in bondage. The same garden that symbolized independence for the new nation did not offer liberation to those who harvested it. And yet within those boundaries, there was knowledge. Enslaved gardeners brought agricultural techniques passed down from African and indigenous traditions. They understood crop cycles, companion planting, and herbal remedies. They worked with their hands, but their knowledge was generational, deep, and largely uncredited. Some of the herbs they grew, sage, thyme, lavender, were not just for seasoning. They were for medicine. They treated coughs, colds, infections. The line between kitchen and infirmary was thin, and the garden was a source of both nourishment and healing. As you walk the imagined paths of that garden, its dirt paths neat between raised beds, you might picture Washington, hands behind his back, inspecting rows of lettuce. But look closer. See the woman bent over pulling weeds, the boy carrying water, the man sharpening a hoe. Their stories are rooted here too. So when we talk about founding fathers, perhaps we should also talk about founding farmers. And ask, whose labor grew the nation's first meals? Labor in the rows, unseen hands, and daily harvests. The Mount Vernon kitchen garden was carefully designed, symmetrical, measured, and recorded in ledgers. But the daily life within its borders was anything but sterile. It was full of movement, sweat, and silence. From sunup to sundown, enslaved workers carried out the rhythms of planting and harvesting, an unpaid choreography that sustained the most powerful man in the New Republic. Their names flicker faintly in the records: Charlotte, who harvested beans; Frank, who turned the compost; Lucy, who gathered herbs for the cookhouse. Some had worked these gardens for decades. Others were children, already expected to weed and haul water by age 6 or 7. Their days began early. Before dawn, they collected tools from the storage shed: iron hose, wooden dibbles, hand-forged trowels. If the weather was cold, they worked with fingers stiff and raw. If it was hot, they sweated through layers of coarse linen. Overseers tracked their pace. Productivity was measured not in well-being but in bushels. Gardening may sound gentle, but this was hard labor. Beds had to be double-dug, turned seasonally, protected from pests. Crops had to be rotated: radishes one month, peas the next, to keep the soil from exhaustion. If a frost hit unexpectedly, it was the workers who bore the blame, even when they had no control. And yet, within the confines of this grueling work, there was pride. The enslaved gardeners knew the land intimately. They knew when the cabbage worms would come, which plants needed more shade, how to transplant seedlings without shock. Their knowledge ensured the garden's success. And though Washington took notes in his journals about the yields, it was their skill that made the harvests possible. Interestingly, the garden wasn't only for vegetables. A section was dedicated to herbs and medicinal plants. Here, enslaved workers cultivated sage for sore throats, mint for digestion, lavender for calming baths, and comfrey for wounds. Some herbs were native. Others had been brought over generations earlier on slave ships, their seeds hidden in hems or hair. These plots were libraries of ancestral wisdom, grown without acknowledgement. The produce from the garden was hauled daily to the kitchen house, where cooks, also enslaved, prepared meals for the Washington family and their guests. Nothing went to waste. Beet greens were stewed. Pea pods became broth. Radish tops were sautéed in lard. The food was simple, yes, but thoughtful, efficient, and deeply rooted in both necessity and heritage. And while the estate's white visitors marveled at the meals and the grounds, they rarely asked, who grew this? Who picked it? Who washed the dirt from these roots? Occasionally, fragments of humanity surface in the records: a note about a gardener asking to keep a pumpkin, a mention of someone punished for taking onions. These glimpses reveal more than theft; they reveal longing, to taste the fruit of one's own labor, to claim, even briefly, a piece of what one has made. Washington himself believed in the virtue of agriculture. He wrote that the cultivation of the earth is the most noble employment of man. But like many of his peers, he failed to see the contradiction, that the noblest labor in his eyes was performed by people he refused to free. Still, the garden endured. Through seasons of war, peace, and shifting ideals, its rows were planted and replanted. It produced food for soldiers, dignitaries, neighbors, and enslaved families alike. And it remains today, a reconstructed site at Mount Vernon, open to tourists, carefully maintained. But what has been lost is harder to recover. The calloused hands, the silent mornings, the whispered knowledge passed between generations, the feeling of placing seeds into soil and knowing you will never own the food that grows. So when we celebrate Washington's agricultural genius, we must also remember the hands beneath the harvest. Because a garden doesn't grow on vision alone. It grows on backs bent under sun, on fingers in the dirt, on names long buried beneath vines. And perhaps we should ask, when we visit historic gardens, are we walking through history or stepping over it? Reaping the legacy, memory, myth, and the garden that remains. Today, if you walk through Mount Vernon's kitchen garden, it appears almost idyllic. Neatly tended rows of herbs and vegetables echo the plans drawn in George Washington's ledgers. Bees buzz between squash blossoms. Interpretive plaques explain how vegetables were rotated, how compost was layered, how the estate remained self-sufficient. But there is little noise, no sound of hose breaking soil, No whispered instructions passed between generations. The garden has been curated, restored for education, framed for memory, but it is quiet in a different way now. The real history lives deeper down, beneath the mulch. Washington's reputation as a farmer and planner remains central to the American mythos. He is remembered not just as a general and president, but as a man of the land, a steward of nature, a symbol of industrious virtue. The kitchen garden supports this image. It shows that he lived simply, cultivated his estate, and fed his household from his own soil. But that image is incomplete. The kitchen garden's beauty, order, and bounty came from the labor of enslaved people, labor Washington meticulously organized, recorded, and relied on. His pride in the garden was also a pride in efficiency, an efficiency sustained by unfree hands. His vision of self-sufficiency was never his alone. Yet the story does not end in bitterness, because despite bondage, the garden was also a site of quiet inheritance. Many enslaved people grew their own small gardens, often after hours, in plots behind cabins. In these tiny spaces, they planted okra, peppers, cowpeas, and sweet potatoes. Seeds passed down from Africa re-emerged in Virginia soil. These gardens were more than subsistence. They were survival strategies, small sanctuaries of control and continuity in a life otherwise owned by others. These traditions carried on after emancipation. Freedmen and women brought their agricultural knowledge into sharecropping systems, rural communities, and eventually urban gardens. The skills honed in places like Mount Vernon seeded generations of black farmers, cooks, herbalists, and horticulturists. Even today, practices like composting, crop rotation, and herbal medicine echo that original knowledge, unwritten but enduring. And so the garden leaves us with questions, not just about who planted the seeds, but whose stories we choose to water. When visitors admire Mount Vernon's lush kitchen beds, they are seeing more than vegetables. They are seeing the product of human resilience, of knowledge that crossed oceans and outlasted chains, of people who were never intended to be remembered, but who fed a nation into being. Maybe in that light, every sprig of parsley is a monument. Every carrot unearthed is an artifact. Every leaf of collard or beet or mint is a record, not just of George Washington's vision, but of the people who made it real, row by row. Dining with diplomats, foreign guests, and American menus. First impressions and cold turkey. In the early days of the Republic, long before lavish state dinners with crystal and caviar, America's diplomatic meals were underwhelming. The new nation, barely stitched together by revolution and ink, had no grand palaces, no fine wines of its own, and very little in the way of culinary tradition. And yet, foreign dignitaries came anyway, curious, skeptical, and often hungry. What they found on the American table was something both strange and telling. There were no buttered escargots, no saffron-stained rice, no gilded soufflés. Instead, there was roast turkey cold, pickled cabbage, brown bread, molasses pie, coffee strong and bitter, and usually silence broken only by the occasional clearing of a throat or clatter of a pewter spoon. Many were surprised, some were disappointed, but almost all understood this was not incompetence, it was intentional. The early American leaders, especially George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams, believed in projecting Republican values through restraint. Lavish meals, they feared, would echo European excess. America's strength was to be found in modesty, simplicity, and virtue, and the table was part of the message. In this philosophy, food became a form of soft diplomacy. Take, for instance, Washington's dinners with French and Spanish envoys. The meals were usually quiet affairs, 3 or 4 courses, served precisely at 3 p.m. Dishes included seasonal vegetables from his estate, stewed game, and perhaps a pudding or a preserved fruit tart. Everything was served with care but without flourish. There was no musical entertainment, no flamboyant host speeches, no endless wine pairings. Guests were expected to eat, observe, and reflect. Many did, and they wrote about it. One French visitor in 1796 noted that Washington's table was austere, though not unpleasant, and that the general ate as a farmer would, neatly, without waste and with little comment. Another, a Prussian diplomat, remarked that the bread was brown and coarse but fresh, and well suited to the principles of liberty. The meals may have lacked elegance, but they were heavy with symbolism. Every ingredient told a story. The cornmeal in the hoe cakes represented local agriculture. The absence of imported sugar reflected boycotts against British goods. The boiled meats, unadorned and lean, reflected a Protestant ethic of discipline. Even the tableware, often simple pewter or plain china, was a statement of frugality. And yet, these meals were not without tension. Many diplomats, especially from France, found the food strange. They were used to sauces, cheeses, wines aged in oak. American food was dry, mildly seasoned, and repetitive. Cold turkey was a common complaint. So were overcooked vegetables, but the experience left a mark. Because while the food did not seduce the palate, it conveyed a message of nationhood. These were not just meals, they were performances of identity. Even Jefferson, who loved French cuisine and kept a French-trained chef, balanced his dinners between personal taste and national image. When entertaining at Monticello, he might serve macaroni pie or a French-style ragout, but always with Virginia wine, southern produce, and cornbread on the side. He, too, knew the meal was a stage. So imagine the table, candlelit but plain, the room warm with hearth heat, pewter plates laid neatly. A diplomat from Europe, fork in hand, tasting collard greens for the first time. Across from him, a statesman in homespun linen, making no apology for the food before him. Because in that moment, the food wasn't just nourishment, it was a declaration. Which leads us to wonder, how much of a nation's power is served on a plate? Protocol, persuasion, and the politics of the plate. To entertain is to persuade, and in the fragile early years of the American Republic, few things were more critical than persuading foreign powers that the nation was legitimate, stable, and dignified. But instead of dazzling their guests with opulence, early American leaders leaned into another strategy: restraint. Dinner for them was not about indulgence, it was about performance. Every element was chosen deliberately, not for aesthetic flair, but for moral message. The bread was homemade. The meat was often wild game, venison, rabbit, quail shot on local land prepared plainly. Imported wines, when offered at all, were minimal. Napkins were folded simply. Table linens were modest. And yet the impression was often profound. At President John Adams's home in Philadelphia, guests were often served boiled mutton, carrots, and cold plum pudding. Nothing elaborate, and yet it impressed in its own way. One British envoy noted in a letter, "They dine as if each meal is a speech, quiet, reserved, carefully chosen, and deeply American." This approach stood in contrast to European diplomatic customs. In Paris, diplomatic meals were Baroque productions. Dozens of courses, choreographed service, live musicians, and courses with ingredients sourced from far corners of the empire. In London, it was much the same. Guests dined for hours, drinking imported wines and finishing with exotic fruits. Every plate was a symbol of imperial reach. America couldn't compete and didn't try to. Instead, its leaders framed simplicity as virtue. This was most visible in Washington's own approach. Though a wealthy landowner, he refused flamboyance in public life. His meals featured what his estate produced: vegetables, preserved fruits, roast meats, hoe cakes made from cornmeal ground on site. Guests who stayed at Mount Vernon noted the regularity, always on time, never excessive, never wasteful. And yet this simplicity required immense effort, especially by enslaved cooks, gardeners, and servants who made it possible. For example, a meal of cold roast duck, sweet potatoes, greens, and berry preserve might have taken all day to prepare. The duck hunted and plucked, the greens harvested and washed, the preserve jarred months earlier from summer's fruit. None of this effort showed at the table, but it was there, hidden beneath the message of moderation. And it wasn't just food, manners mattered too. Conversation at formal meals was minimal during the meal, more expansive afterward. Guests were not expected to compliment the host on the food. In fact, to do so excessively was sometimes considered vulgar. Grace was always said. Discussions of politics were avoided. Even laughter, if too loud, could be seen as inappropriate in elite company. But once the food was cleared, the real diplomatic work began. Jefferson understood this well. At Monticello and in Washington, he hosted small, semi-private dinners, 8 to 12 guests, where he could steer conversation after the meal in a more relaxed, candle-lit setting. The food opened the door, the conversation sealed the impression. He famously served ice cream encased in puff pastry, an unheard-of luxury in America at the time, but followed it with a plain salad of native greens. To French guests, it showed sophistication. To Americans, it showed humility. Jefferson had mastered the balance between European allure and American idealism. But not every guest was charmed. Some left with notes of confusion. A Swedish diplomat complained that the beef was tough, the bread dark, and the sauce missing entirely. A French nobleman wrote that American hosts serve meat as they serve government, without decoration, without apology. And yet the effect was often intentional. The early American table said, "We are new, we are plain, but we are serious." A boiled potato could speak louder than an orchestra if it told the story of a nation building itself from the soil up. So as forks tapped quietly on pewter plates, as pickled cabbage was passed in silence, foreign guests weren't just dining, they were witnessing a statement of national philosophy. Which leaves us to consider, when a nation feeds its guests simplicity, is it humility or power, carefully dressed as modesty? From modest meals to culinary diplomacy. As the 19th century progressed, America's confidence grew, and so did its meals. The modest fare served to foreign diplomats in the early republic began to evolve. Not all at once and not everywhere, but slowly and with purpose. The food became more refined, the presentations more thoughtful. The message shifted. America was still virtuous and simple, yes, but it could also be cultured, hospitable, and deserving of equal respect on the world stage. Yet that transition was far from uniform. For many decades, America remained defined by the contrast between its ideals and its ingredients. Even as state dinners grew more polished, many dignitaries continued to note the same features: coarse bread, unsweetened coffee, cold meats, and a certain bluntness to hospitality. And in many ways, that was the point. The early republic believed that true leadership was proven not in opulence, but in restraint. That democracy was best served with a side of simplicity, and that character was more important than cuisine. Still, behind the scenes, much was changing. By the mid-1800s, foreign chefs were being hired in American cities. Cookbooks expanded. Trade increased. The rise of urban hotels meant more elaborate dinners, and diplomatic meals became longer, more orchestrated, more cosmopolitan. Yet the legacy of the early dinners never disappeared. The philosophy that food could carry meaning, that a meal could be a kind of national performance, stuck. Presidents began to use menus to communicate not just taste, but values. Abraham Lincoln, during wartime, chose basic meals of mutton and stewed apples. Franklin Roosevelt, during the Great Depression, banned cocktail service at White House dinners. John F. Kennedy used French-inspired meals to signal sophistication and modernity. Each course was a cue, each ingredient a message. Today, diplomatic dining in the U.S. is a carefully choreographed affair. Menus are crafted months in advance. Every dish tells a story, often blending local flavors with nods to the guest's home country. A Vietnamese dignitary might be served catfish from the Mississippi Delta, seasoned with lemongrass. A French ambassador might receive Virginia quail in a Bordeaux reduction. And yet, if you look closely, the roots remain. The cornbread served with a modern stew, the roasted root vegetables, the way American wines are proudly poured, once unthinkable. These are not just culinary choices. They are echoes of the first quiet dinners in Philadelphia and Mount Vernon, when the table was set not for applause but for principle. It reminds us that diplomacy is not only fought with treaties and speeches, it is also served, plate by plate, bite by bite. And what began with cold turkey and brown bread evolved into something more nuanced, but never fully abandoned its origins. So the next time you hear of a state dinner or see photographs of leaders toasting at a table adorned with delicate greens and artisan breads, remember, the first guests dined in silence. The meals were plain, the hosts nervous, the nation still raw. But even then, the table was already a stage. And perhaps that's the question this story leaves us with. In a world where presentation is power, can a quiet, simple meal still command respect?